Hello, in this video we're going to be talking about food chains and food webs, so let's not waste any of your time. Let's get right to it. Now when we're talking food chains and food webs, what we really want to focus on is not only the material that we shared in the first video, but how that affects or what that looks like at each of the levels, the trophic levels, the feeding positions. In other words, if we're making a food chain, it obviously starts with the sun, and then it goes to producers, and then herbivores, and then your series of carnivores. And in some cases, an animal could be one level in a particular food chain, and then a different animal in another food chain. So it's not cut and dry. Some animals can do both plants and meat, and they go back and forth based on resources. I mean, the oddity of a black bear or a grizzly bear is the fact that they can catch salmon or catch a deer, or they can also eat berries. So it is not straightforward, but just some terms to be thinking about. Consumers, obviously, we know what a consumer is as far as us. We go out and buy something. Consumer in this scenario is something that has to go out and eat something. In other words, to gain energy. They are not a producer like a plant that is able to take sunlight and convert that into sugars through photosynthesis. So that's really, you got the two groups, producers or consumers, and then of course the consumers have a multitude of levels, which we're going to look at here. Okay, so along with consumers and producers, consumers also are called heterotrophs because they have to go out and get energy by breaking apart and eating organisms, digesting them, and absorbing those sugars. And then of course you've got a series of consumers. You got your primary, which are your herbivores. You've got your secondary, which are now carnivores. And then of course tertiary, and you can go on up into the apex or the top, predators. So if you've got our prairie ecosystem we looked at last time, I mean, obviously your plants would be your autotrophs, your photoautotrophs. Autotrophs is really, it's what they're called, but really autotrophs is the umbrella term. That just means something that can make energy out of something. So really the right term would be photoautotrophs, which I think I have in a slide here coming up, because they use light to make energy, as opposed to a chemoautotroph that would be using chemical compounds to make energy. And some other words to throw out there. Omnivores, like a bear or a raccoon. They can eat multiple trophic levels. So in some instances, a raccoon would be the herbivore, and other times it would be one of the carnivores. But another usually unthought of group, but a super important group, the decomposers or the detritivores. This can be fungi. This can be a vulture. Where their incredible or very important role is the fact of converting dead things and getting that energy from those and putting it back into the system. So a raccoon gets ran over or dies, and that energy is going to be non used if it just decomposes. Of course, bacteria would use that energy and eats that raccoon, at least the muscle tissue and things like that. Then it can get energy from that, and of course eventually the vulture will get eaten by something as well. But decomposers, they break down that dead material, organic material, and put that energy back into the system. So they have a very important important job. And I kind of mentioned these words ahead of time, ahead of when I should have, but here they are. Just make sure you gain those. But again, the term autotrophs is the umbrella term, meaning we make energy out of something, and then the prefix is added to distinguish what they use. So a photoautotroph uses light energy. A chemoautotroph will use chemical breakdown of chemical organics, and go from there. And of course, heterotrophs, as I mentioned, something that has to eat energy from eating plant material. All right, so here we're looking at obviously a food web. We've seen a couple of food chains so far, but food webs, I mean, food chains are nice. That's nice for, you think of the, elementary, middle school students looking at those. And again, these would be conceptual models because they're just simply flow charts, no numbers, nothing like that. But it's just kind of showing you who's eating who. The arrows point to the eater, not to what's eaten. So, for example, you got your grasses in this particular ecosystem will be eaten by the bison and the elk. The leaves, the snow hare, the snowshoe hare will eat those. The seed pods, the beavers, as well as the tree and the berries. And so, the deer mice are eaten by the raven. Excuse me. It must be a pretty big bird to eat a mouse, but anyway. And the coyotes, and of course the gophers are eaten by the weasels, and the elk and bison, the gray wolves, and of course the bear. You can see has some green arrows going toward it, and has some red arrows going towards it as well. So again, an example of an omnivore and the complexity of understanding an ecosystem. This will also bring into play the predator-prey relationship. You've got your predators, your coyotes, your gray wolves, your short-tailed weasels, and even your raven to some extent. And you got your prey, which are the herbivores. Typically, we don't consider herbivores and plants predator-prey simply because the plants are just stationary. The prey has to do something with the catch, with the process involved there. So something else to think about in an ecosystem. So what would happen to this ecosystem if the snowshoe hares were removed? Say whether overeaten, the coyotes overate them, or disease, or something changed to where the snowshoe hare wasn't there any longer. Okay, well, you might think, well, nothing. The coyotes had just switched to eating the beavers and the pocket gophers, and that's probably true. But then, what would happen to the beavers and pocket gopher populations now that there's one less food source, and you have the possibility of overeating, reducing those greatly, if not eliminating them, but reducing them greatly. And now you've greatly reduced 3 of your herbivores. Okay, so what's that going to do to the plant population? Okay, the plant population may grow. Okay, and then if that grows, maybe it brings in other herbivores. Maybe it changes in that. But the take-home message is that a removal of something or a change of something greatly alters the whole dynamic of an ecosystem. So if I take out one of the herbivores, then that's going to make the predators or the carnivores focus on a different food source, and maybe that food source runs out. Okay, because that balance is not there any longer. If all of a sudden, if I have 4 hungry eaters and I've got 5 things to eat, okay, we can all be good. But if I reduce that to 3, now we've got a situation where, okay, now we don't have an abundance of food, we have limited food, and that can make all kinds of changes. Because if you eliminate your herbivore line, then your producer line is going to exponentially grow. And again, maybe that brings in other herbivores. But if you lose your herbivore line, then you're going to lose your predators. And so if the coyotes have to leave because there's not enough of the smaller animals to eat while we're trying to get a big animal, then your bison and elk population can explode. And an example here in Missouri, and if you're not from Missouri, wait, this is Crowder, never mind. Well, you don't have to be from Missouri, but anyway, is the management of deer population. 100, 200 years ago, when the choices were made to kind of eliminate those top predators because of cattle production, which is important. Not giving an opinion on that. But you keep the deer because they're not going to eat the cattle, and they're not going to bother anything. Then you have an explosion of that population. So a change produces other change, and then the ecosystem has to try to figure out what's the best balance. Okay, another type, and this is kind of a comparison. The grazing food chain, which we've seen a couple of, that's just your sunlight, which is the ultimate source of energy. Then your producers, your plants. Then your primary consumer, which is your herbivore. Then your secondary, in this case, the snake eating the mouse, and then the hawk eating the snake. And then eventually the hawk dies, and your decomposers break down that tissue and put it back into the system. But as opposed to the detritus food chain, which is dead material. Okay, so plant material died, so maybe the fungus, in this case a woodlouse, eats on it, termites, whatever it might be, and then the birds come along and eat those things. That's more of a detritus. You could also throw in, raccoon on the road, a vulture, and then a coyote eats the vulture, that kind of stuff as well. Alright, one more thing to take a look at here in this one is the food pyramid, and I'm sure you've seen these, but it is garnered by the 10% rule. Don't forget about that only 10% of the energy produced at a particular level passes on to the next level. So you got your producer levels. I mean, they make a certain amount of energy, and then only 10% of that is passed on, and you can see that if it's 100,000 and it's 10,000 and 1,000, 100 and 10. So by the time you get to that hawk or that eagle or that top predator, maybe it's a coyote, there's very few, and that's not because of it's because of sustainability. That area can only sustain so many of those top predators. There's just not enough energy in the system to have a whole bunch. Well, that's our video over food chains and food webs. When we come back together next time, we're talking the biogeochemical cycles, the carbon cycle, water cycle, that kind of stuff. So we'll see you then.